Perfect. So yeah, my name is Fred Heiding. I'm a research fellow in computer science over at Harvard. And if you have any questions about this presentation, me and my colleague will be in the question room afterwards. So feel free to come by and ask us anything. So let's get started. I want to shout out a quick word to the team and everyone who worked on this project. Again, I'm a computer science researcher. Most of my life has been very technical. I worked with red teaming of a wide range of devices such as IoT and especially embedded devices. I've done some pretty cool hacks. I hacked the King of Sweden, which was fun. I was here at Black Hat last year talking about how AI empowers a wide range of different cyber attacks. I was at B-Sides yesterday talking about AI-empowered phishing. But for the past years, I've been focusing more and more on policy and business and taking the holistic view on computer security. And the reason for that is that a lot of the people I meet and discuss my technical solutions with really say that you have to be able to translate this into growth and profitability, and how will the board members actually think it's important to prioritize cybersecurity, and how will the policy members do this? And I think this is super intriguing, which brings me to Alex O'Neill, who's a fantastic cybersecurity researcher on the policy side. He's an expert on US policies, done a lot of work on emerging threats such as crypto and threat actors such as Russia and North Korea. Then we have Lachlan. Lachlan was part of the team that created Australia's national cybersecurity strategy. For those of you who haven't read it, it's a fantastic document. A lot of other countries followed and was inspired by that. And a lot of the things we did here is that we asked ourselves, what would Lachlan and his team have liked to have when they created their strategy? What could they have had for tools that helped them? And then we did that to help future generations of the strategy creators. Eric Rosenbach is a senior lecturer at Harvard Kennedy School. He's an incredibly senior fellow with a bunch of experience from security and national security positions in the White House. And this team is what we had. We bounced our head together. And the first question I kind of want to ask is, why are we doing this? And we all know that the cyber threat landscape is changing a lot. This is nothing new. Technology such as AI is really ruffling the playing field a little bit. And it makes me think, how will we proceed to secure the digital landscape that we live in? There are a lot of ways to do it. One way to do it is for these national cybersecurity strategies. And these documents are fairly new. They're usually 20 to 100 pages. They contain a bunch of different sections, such as how do we protect our people? How do we protect the critical infrastructure of the US? How do we generate capacity? And so forth. And most of these documents were created just within the past few years. They're never really more than a decade old. And this is good. It's really good that we create these strategies, but they pose one important question. And that is, do we really know what we're doing here? There we go. It's hard to create good cybersecurity strategy. We need to satisfy all the different stakeholders, such as the policymakers, the deep technical experts, and the business leaders. And we also need to ensure that these strategies do what they're supposed to do, which is protect the people and protect the institutions. So we got ourselves a bunch of questions that we really need to answer, such as, what does it mean for a strategy document to be good? And who is reading these national cybersecurity strategies? Are they actually useful in practice? They are political documents, but how technical should they really be? And we were really intrigued by these questions. We kept on asking them, and as we talked to people, more questions kept popping up. Everyone said collaborations is important, but how should we facilitate collaborations? Well, should we recommend it, or should we even force collaborations? So all of this made us want to know, well, how can we help policymakers make better cyber strategy? That's really what we want to do. And we hope this talk is relevant for everyone, because you're really affected by the national cybersecurity strategy, no matter if you're a technical practitioner, if you're a policymaker, of course, if you're a business leader. There are a lot of different environments. We can just see the examples of the European regulations with GDPR versus American data privacy regulations. They affect business. So knowing how your country operates and what their strategy is will help you, no matter what field you're in. So that was a quick introduction about why we do this. From here on, the talk will have two primary parts. I will talk a little bit about the method we used, how we created this framework. And after that, I'll talk about the actual highlights. I will dive into the results and see what can we learn. What did we learn from all these different strategies that we analyzed? And then we'll have a big conclusion, and then we'll talk a little bit more with questions for those who are interested. So there are other people who do this type of analysis, and we talk with a lot of the folks who created the other strategy analysis. We talk with some of the people who criticized these other scorings, and we were thinking, how can we improve this? So the first thing that bugged us a little bit is that a lot of other analysis of national strategies used absolute scoring. So they say, for example, the United States is a 7 of 10, and the Netherlands is an 8 of 10. And that poses the questions, what does that mean? How are these numbers justified? And what is the algorithm behind this scoring? And it's really hard to get that right, because there's so many variables. We all know this, right? Cyber is incredibly complicated. So to justify these scores, it's kind of tricky. The other thing that bugged us a little bit is, well, how does it all play together? Can you score countries in isolation? We don't really think you can do that. We have to see the relevant difference. Like, how do these all play together? Because both in companies and with countries, to some degree, you kind of only need to secure yourself as much as it's more difficult to hack you than your neighbor. And these things are actually quite true. And there's a lot of other ways the countries work together. So we don't think that we can score countries in isolation. And that's why we created our relative scoring. So we just saw, well, what are the good points we can highlight that other people can learn from? Who is a leading in critical infrastructure protection? It doesn't really matter if they're a 7 or a 5 or whatever, but do they do something good that we can learn from? And that led us to the scorecard. And we have a framework for creating these scorecards. And in the first iteration, we included 9 different governments. So we applied a framework, we scored them, and we learned a bunch of things. If your country is not included in this list, we work on a lot of future versions. So please reach out to us. We might be scoring your country right now. And if your country is in this list, you're of course very welcome to ask more about that too. So the reason and how we selected the governments is that, first of all, we wanted to see people who had somewhat of a strong cyber capability. That is deliberately ambiguous. It can look in a few different ways, but they had to have some sort of reputation here. We also wanted diversity. They can be the size of the country, where it's located, how it's operating, but it should differ in some way. We also wanted fairly new documents, published after 2020, and they had to be accessible in English. So that led us to these countries. When we had these 9 countries, we applied our evaluation framework. I'm going to briefly talk about what that is in the next slide, but we applied a bunch of different criteria, such as how well do they protect this version of people protection or critical infrastructure. We made 268 quantifiable questions. These all boil down to yes/no questions that are quite specific, so it's a rather extensive framework. Again, if you're interested, there's a white paper coming out, so you should definitely look into that. But I will cover it to some degree in this talk as well. When we did that, we got some sort of an idea about who is leading in this area, who is meeting the bar, and who is lagging behind a little bit and could potentially be improved. So that's what we learned. And when we had those scores and this information, then we tried to figure out, well, is this actually practically relevant? So we had a bunch of interviews with cyber agency leaders and other expert professionals and said, hey, this is what we think of the Australian cyber policies, etc. Do you agree? Then we updated the scores, and then we looked at the relative difference. Again, we see, well, maybe one country is doing something that's not exceptional, but all the other countries are really bad in this area. So then there's still a leader, and it's probably relevant to find out why is no one else doing this. Then we can learn from this. So our focus was always how to make this practically applicable and useful for practitioners. So with that being done, this is the framework we actually used for analyzing these countries. And I just want to give a quick word here, because it's rather important. First of all, we analyzed how are the responsibilities codified. Who is responsible for what? This is actually very important, because all the documents talk about we have to secure our energy sector. But who is responsible for doing that? This is really, really important to ensure that someone is following up, someone is doing what they're supposed to be doing, and so forth. So we evaluated that. After that, we evaluated how well is the people protected, how well is the infrastructure protected, and so forth. This is obviously one of the cornerstones of the strategy documents. All of them talk about this a lot. They could be improved in some ways, but the protection is a key feature. Capacity generation is also a key feature. Almost everyone in this room knows that there is a shortage of skilled cyber labor. Fortunately, this is a very strong focus of all the documents, so they work with this. A few things still needs to be improved, but it's rather good. After this, we assessed, well, how well do you work with partnerships? You can't do cyber in isolation. You need to work together with other countries. You need to work inside of the country and work between different agencies, work with industry. Cyber partnership is quite complex, but they're very important. Some strategies work with them a lot. Some could be improved. Lastly, we analyzed how well is this all communicated. It's actually quite positive. It's really easy to read these strategy documents. They're fun and interesting reads, which we think is great. However, some things could be improved with the communication as well. The language is often rather hand-wavy. Especially me as a technical practitioner, I really like specific language, specific deadlines, and so forth. And they are quite abstract, which we think could be improved. So with that being said, that's just a quick overview. So I wanted you to know how we did this and what we all went about with it. And after that, the real fun and interesting part is what we discover, what we learn. And this is everything I'm going to talk about from now on. First, I'm going to give some overview highlights across the board. Then I'm going to dive into country-specific highlights. And here we can see some metadata about all these different countries. This should not be taken as gospel. Again, the page lengths sometimes vary. Some have different font sizes. South Korea's document actually have double-sized pages. So don't take this as gospel, but you should see that the lengths vary a lot. Some strategies are really long. Some strategies are a bit shorter. And that doesn't affect the quality. This is quite important to know. It's almost like a good old-fashioned school report, right? You can write a short report really good, or a long report rather bad. But it's important to know that they differ. You don't really need to fix the document at a certain length. They also have a number of supporting documents. And this is rather complex to know how many supporting documents do we want to include. There are different ways to create this delimitation. The way we worked with is that if the strategy mentions, for critical infrastructure protection, everything here is discussed in the critical infrastructure protection plan, well, then we have to read it to make a feasible evaluation, and so forth. More discussion about this is also mentioned in the white paper. So that brings us to some of the actual scores that we learned here. And there's a lot of information here. The first thing we can say is that codifying responsibilities, we're going to zoom in to all of these scores soon, but codifying responsibilities is done rather well across the board. There's some things that could be improved, but they mention at least, like this person is responsible, this agency is responsible for this task. We're pretty happy with that. And we're going to see some cases where that can be improved. We're going to see some cases where that's actually a highlight and other countries could follow it. So everyone talks about protecting people and protecting institutions and critical infrastructure. That's good. These bullets are rather broad. They have a lot of sub-bullets. So there's some countries that are really good at protecting the communication industry, but they're not so good at protecting the healthcare and so forth. So there's quite a lot of things that we still think could be improved here, but it is OK. For the capacity generation, that's really good. It's clear that all the documents focus a lot about generating capacity. We need to have more cyber practitioners. I think that one reason why this is such a leading bullet across the board might be that it's a little bit easier to generate, perhaps, from an agency. Like you can say that we have a budget. This budget should go to a research institution or to more cyber education programs and so forth and so forth. So this is really done in a pretty practical way, and we see some good highlights and success cases as well. So that's great. Partnerships happen. There are some really good cyber partnerships, but it's tricky. Sometimes countries have really good regional partnerships, but their interagency partnerships is not working out in a sufficient way. So there's a lot of ways where this could work, but it also couldn't work. So you really have to zoom in and see which kind of partnerships does your country prioritize, and how do you work with different types of partnerships. Again, communication is great in terms of language. These documents are pretty easy to digest. They have a nice language to read. Most people can read and understand them, but they are hand-wavy. They are abstract. They fail to be detailed, specific, practical, and so forth, which we really think should be improved. It has to be at least somehow specified for people to know how to take this, how to really read in this information, so it is not words that sound good. After that, I'm going to show you some highlights across the board that we think is really worth across all the countries, or almost all the countries we saw. This is things that are quite interesting and that really stands out. Everyone is again working with entrepreneurship, developing a cyber workforce, developing the ecosystem. And they're really good, right? Governments know that we can just have a strong country without having strong cyber companies. And this is not only cyber companies. This is to ensure that the entire technical workforce, which to some degree is the entire workforce these days, have cyber hygiene, have good cyber practices, and so forth. So this really is a highlight. They work with it. They work with it in rather satisfactory ways, and that's cool. We also see that most countries really do prioritize critical infrastructure. That's pretty good. There are things that could be improved here. Even though they prioritize critical infrastructure, sometimes they don't have perfect deadlines, they don't have the greatest plans, but we wanted to highlight the fact that they mention it, because these documents would be somewhat of a failure if they didn't really focus on critical infrastructure protection. Industry partnerships are also really important. The documents work with them a lot. Most countries know that we can't just generate capacity within the industry. We need to use that capacity in the government. We need to collaborate with it. We need to create strong capacity and work with that. So we think that's a great way to do this. That's quite a good highlight. The documents also work a lot with emerging threats like AI and quantum and these kind of things, and that's really good. Most of these agencies they're kind of quick to adapt to changes. They're nimble, and we think that's really positive. They know that the cyber threat landscape is changing. We can't just be static. We need to improve, and we need to work with emerging threats. So that's a pretty strong highlight. Again, the language is easy to understand. We oftentimes can read these documents. They're not too abstract. They're not too difficult to understand, and so forth. So that's a really good point. These are some strengths across the board. We do have to mention a few improvement suggestions as well, so let's jump to them now. One thing that really stands out, and I think this is a shame, is protecting vulnerable populations. A lot of my research in other areas discovered that modern cyber attacks often exploit vulnerable users. And there's a lot of different types of vulnerable users, but vulnerable users are often exploited and targeted to a larger and larger degree. And unfortunately, that can be understood, because this can be low-hanging fruit for cyber attackers and for people who want to access a company or just scam people and so forth. And vulnerable population are almost always excluded with a solid protection plan from these strategy documents. I think that really is a shame. One rationale might be that the first thing is to protect critical infrastructure and the industry, and when that's done, maybe in the future iterations, these documents will talk about vulnerable populations. But we think that they do deserve a more reasonable protection plan. A really strong weakness is also generating capacity for non-technical cyber professionals. We do educate cyber professionals and hackers, and that's great, but what about the cyber lawyers? What about really proficiently skilled cyber policymakers who know the cyber deeply? And sometimes there's discussions about it, but we think there needs to be a much stronger focus about generating non-technical cyber professionals too. Again, this might be a situation where, in the first sense, the documents create the general technical cyber skills, and after that, they will work with this. But we think that these existing documents should have a stronger focus about this one too. Incentives is really hard, right? But this is so important. How do we incentivize companies to prioritize cybers? We heard in a bunch of interviews that how do you convert this into growth and profitability and wealth and so forth? And that's tricky. And we really want to find better ways to incentivize cyber to make it's hard, right? I do some business projects about this as well, but we think that the documents don't really address this satisfactorily. There are some mentions for it, and one way is just to create really strong class action lawsuits, and then that will be an incentive in itself. But we think we need more incentives to prioritize cyber. And again, the documents don't really have measurable, clear-cut outcomes that are easy to follow, and that is a little bit of a shame. Even if there are great ideas, if the documents don't talk about how to implement these ideas, who will implement them, when, and what exactly we deliver, what's the contingency plan for following this up? More countries should work with that as well. Some general discussions are quite interesting. It's not necessarily good or bad, but it's things that came up in a lot of discussions, things we heard when we read these documents and so forth. It's how to balance regulations, incentives, and recommendations. There's a lot of opinions here. Again, a big difference is between the US and the European Union. The European Union works quite strongly with regulations in some ways. And we don't think that there's necessarily a right or wrong. There are some case-dependent situations. But it's an interesting question that we probably should look into more. And what roles and powers should modern cyber agencies have? This is really interesting. We interviewed a lot of cyber agencies that did a fantastic work over the roughly the last 5 years, to innovate, to modernize. Some of them work like startups within the government. And it's pretty cool. They really do this well. But they also know, and there's this sense that where do we go from here? Because you kind of have to run to stand still in this sense. And it's not really clear what should a good cyber agency look like in 5 years or even in 10 years. And these are really interesting questions that we think is worth asking. And how to fight cybercrime in a more offensive sense? How do we achieve attribution? And how should we work with disruption? How offensive should we be, et cetera, et cetera? These are really good questions as well. Sometimes it's hard to know if some cyber criminal groups work across countries, right? It's not even certain which country they operate from and who to blame for that. And it's quite tricky. There are some good examples of countries working with this, but we do think that this question needs to be studied more. And it's not necessarily a weakness, but it's an interesting problem that's somehow common through a lot of the different strategies. And all types of collaboration and cooperation is really interesting. What are the best models for working regionally and locally, inside the different agencies? How should they cooperate? And we see a lot of different examples. Again, not necessarily good or bad, but just different types of regional partnership, different type of interagency and intra-agency partnerships, and so forth. And this is interesting. And having really solid partnerships and collaboration and cooperations, that's probably a key to tackling cybercrime. And we do believe here as well that more work can be done. That's a high-level picture. Now I want to show some country-specific highlights for what did the US do well and what did Australia do well and so forth. We can't possibly show everything we learned from all the different countries, so we also encourage you to read the white papers here again if you're really interested in some specific country that you didn't see. Starting with the US, shifting responsibilities from users to private companies is really good. And there are two highlights, there are a lot of highlights, but we think this is great. I've done a lot of my research on hacking IoT devices, such as smart door locks and so forth, and discovered it's really easy to hack these devices and cause a lot of harm to users. And that is quite bad. The same way, the user shouldn't have to deal with this. Like me as a user shouldn't be threatening my family with difficult security situation if I buy a smart door lock that's not properly secured. So we really do believe there should be more liability for the companies to create secure products. I think this is a great thing and all. And the US really works with this. It shines through. It is quite good. A metaphor I like to use is that if you go to the supermarket and buy some food, I have to sort of expect that food to be healthy, right? I can't expect my apple to be dangerous. And that's good. It's because there's a lot of regulations saying that you can't have unhealthy food that you sell. And this is a big discussion, but we do think that somehow this should be true for cyber as well. And the US really works with that. The US is also a pretty strong national sort of standard maker. They have a lot of global institutions and organizations. They really work with protecting shared resources. And for better or worse, we think this is a quite strong strength that is a position that some countries need to take. Some areas for improvement. The data privacy laws really aren't ideal in the US, we do believe. They are quite fragmented between the states. It's difficult to know for a user and for companies. Where should we have, in which state should we have our servers? Where should we have our data, and so forth? This is a big discussion, but we do think it should be improved. Also, the vulnerable populations are really excluded from protection in the US strategy. In the UK, the one thing I really like about the UK strategy, there's a lot of good things, but the Industry 100 initiative is great. It's a fantastic highlight that a lot of other states followed, which basically means that they remove bureaucratical hurdles for industry practitioners to work with the government. That's really good. So they took a bunch of cybersecurity experts from the industry. They made a limited security clearance need for these to help the government. It's really a win-win situation. For the government learned from these cyber industry experts, and they created it in a way so that there can't really be any security risks of having this happening. So that's a great way of how to reduce bureaucracy, to foster collaboration between the industry and the state. They also have a cyber essentials model. It's a little bit older, but that's a really good way to ensure a baseline security. A lot of countries follow that after they created it, to just ensure that we have some sort of a baseline security standard. The UK do work a lot with good critical infrastructure protections. I shouldn't bash them down too much here, but incentivizing CI owners to do really good work is quite tricky. We have seen some sectors, such as the healthcare, that suffered from a lot of attacks recently. We should, of course, mention that they have really good critical infrastructure areas, such as the Telecom Critical Infrastructure Protection Act. So they have good areas, but incentivizing these owners to do good work, we found that seems to be a little bit problematic. We're also not certain about their forward defense and disruptions. I should really mention here that the UK forward defense and disruption plan and how they work with offensive security. They probably do this a lot. There's obviously a lot of things we don't know about. But from what we read in the strategy, we didn't think that was too impressive. Again, that might be a strategic choice, because you don't want to add it there, but we think it's worth mentioning. A few words about Australia. They have a pretty good separation of assistance and law enforcement. So when should they assist and when should they enforce something? It's quite easy to know, and this goes across several parts of the Australian strategy document. It's rather easy to know who to contact, when something happening, what should you do, and so forth and so forth. There's a lot of good success cases learned from in here. They also have a really good harmonization of critical infrastructure regulations. They have a Security of Critical Infrastructure Act that's really good. It's quite clear across the board. They have a pretty coherent protection plan. We think it's really making sense who is responsible for what and how they protect different parts of their critical infrastructure. You also have cyber wardens, which is a pretty cool concept that we really encourage people to read into more, which adds a bit to cyber responsibility as well. And it could add to protecting vulnerable groups and small medium enterprises by having local cyber responsible officers who can help people out. They're partnering with local and regional governments. It's not always ideal. We think more work could be done here. It's not perfectly clear from the cyber strategy documents. And another interesting point to mention is the civil society and nonprofit sector. So Australia has a really strong document, so really nitpicking on some details here. But I kind of like this bullet because it poses the point in question, how much should a country protect civil society and nonprofit sector? Obviously, the critical infrastructure should be protected more. But some protection should still be given here, and we think it's quite lacking from the Australian strategy. Also, non-technical cyber professionals, it would have been good, since, again, this is a really good strategy document, but they do lag quite heavily and don't really mention how to foster skills in the non-technical cyber practitioner workforce. Singapore is a super interesting example, because they're quite different. They're more totalitarian straight and really have a centralization of authority, which allows them to protect people in a way that the other countries don't really do. And that's quite impressive. So this is a different political context. A lot of these documents are political in nature, and we really see that with Singapore. They differ in this. So that's quite cool. They can protect the country in a way that other countries cannot. They also have a really good zero trust protection plan for protecting the governments, which seems to work rather well. Singapore's document is another highlight. It's just a really good document. They work very well with cybersecurity. They take a regional leadership role for their close neighbors. They kind of know that if they help some of their neighbors do better cybersecurity, everyone will benefit in the end, which we think is really good. There's a lot of good highlights to read from here. A few areas that we still think could be improved is that somehow the accountable parties are not always specifically clear here. And since Singapore is a shorter document, this is, again, there's a little bit more of a need to be clear and concise with what you say. And they use a lot of hand-wavy language like, the government will do this, and so forth. And we really do believe that the more specific you can be, the better it is. It's difficult to be specific because it's a bit dangerous and risky, because if you say something specific, you have to follow up on it. But if you don't say something specific, well, then it falls a little bit short, we believe. So they work well with ransomware, I should say. They have a lot of work in their previous strategy document about ransomware protection plans, but in their modern strategy that was released recently, they don't talk so much about counter-ransomware strategy, so we think this could be improved to some degree as well. A few more highlights from all the countries. Again, there are much more documents in the white paper too. Germany works rather well with intra-government protection plans. I think this is pretty remarkable, because my stereotype of Germany is a rather bureaucratic country. It's not always streamlined, but they have a pretty good plan for modernizing the government and streamlining the cooperation between different cyber agencies within the government. And this is really, really good. Japan actually have a cybersecurity for all plan. They work with securing vulnerable populations and small medium enterprises, and this is really good. It might be relevant for other countries to read this a little bit and try to learn more from how they can secure vulnerable populations. South Korea does a really good job of tackling their actual threat and really having a practically applicable plan. And a lot of times, that is protecting against North Korea. Their older plan, which was released quite a lot of years ago, didn't really treat North Korea. They got some criticism for not being anchored in reality, and they should do more stuff against that. And they really changed that in their new strategy that was released this year. So they work with offensive security. They work with dismantling regional threat. This is also a great example to see that you can't create a one-size-fits-all national cybersecurity plan. You have to see who is your closest adversary. And they do this rather well. We think that Germany should probably work a bit more with workforce development, at least based on what we find in the strategy document. It's not too clear there. Japan should work a little bit more with market development in general. And South Korea could probably protect the private organizations a bit more. So these are relatively similar points, and these are just some highlights from the different countries. Again, if you have a country that's not included here, check out the white paper or talk with us for future reports, because we do a lot of more work in this area as well. So with that being said, I want to give a few concluding remarks, say what's happening next and what we'll work on from now. And after that, see how can we take this and what should you take with you to work with in your daily lives. A few next steps. We have a report coming up in September and October. If anyone is interested, we really encourage you to reach out to us or subscribe to the newsletter of the Debt Center at the Harvard Belfer Center. You will get all the updates and see that report as well. We do work with a couple of new scorecards. So we have one scorecard for totalitarian states with countries such as Iran and Russia and North Korea, and see how do their cyber strategy plans differ from cyber strategy plans from other countries. This is going to be quite interesting. We also work with one plan from small budget and third world states and see what's different and how should your framework different when you create a cybersecurity strategy for a country with a very small budget or that's not so technical, and so forth and so forth. We also work with new implementation areas. So we do the same thing we did here, but for artificial intelligence, and compare national AI strategies. And that's quite interesting to see, because a lot of these documents are new and created over the past couple of years. So also assessing how will that affect the climate that we're changing. So a few takeaways that I want everyone to follow with from here. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to national cybersecurity strategy. This really is important. So you have to see the context of your country. That's why we create this framework, so that you can learn and take the highlights and see, this worked really well in Australia, but it didn't work well in Germany. And then you can try to deduce, well, will it work good in Sweden? Maybe, maybe not, but at least you can learn. So you have to see what worked and how is the political context of that country. Some common shortcomings across the board is protecting vulnerable population. I've been hammering that down quite a lot, but I really do believe that the vulnerable population needs more protection. So we hope that that should be something that future documents can protect more. We also would like measurable goals. A lot of the words in these documents are rather hand-wavy. They're really good and they have a great plan, but it could be a bit more specific. And I think for the future, to have these contingency plans to follow up and to really see we had this goal, it's super clear. Did it happen within the next couple of years? That is rather important. We also want to say that everyone is really affected and everyone contributes to national security. Everything is digital in this modern world, and it doesn't really matter if you're a cyber agency maker, if you're a technical practitioner, or a business leader. You have something to contribute with. And this is quite important. You can learn from it and see, well, if the national strategy plan mentions that we're going to prioritize, we're going to add a lot of new funding for protection of vulnerable population, maybe that's a new business leg that you can do in your cyber awareness business or whatever. So by staying up to date with the national cybersecurity, it's actually really important. You can get a business advantage from your business as well. So we do, as these documents get better, and they are really good, we encourage more and more people to read them, although they are primarily political documents. And by analyzing this, you can hopefully leverage it to create some better change for yourself. So with that being said, I want to give one last thanks to the entire team, to Lachlan and Alex here in the front row, and to Eric Rosenbach back in Cambridge. And thank you all for listening so much. And we have a few minutes to open up for questions if anyone in the room wants to ask a question now. So thank you.
Attention attendees, if anyone has any questions, please approach one of the mics located in the aisle to ask the question. Thank you.
Yeah. Hey.
Excuse me.
I think they might throw a question be around to the mic over there, but...
Hello?
Hey.
Yeah, I'll throw out a quick question for you.
Yeah, thank you.
I was really pleased to see your focus on protecting vulnerable populations, because for many years, it seems that national security agencies have shirked responsibility on the basis that that's a law enforcement problem, not a national security problem. So in these 9 policies from well-developed economies, how many of those governments seem to accept that protecting vulnerable people from overseas predation is actually part of a national security remit? How many of them actually accept that it is a national security problem to protect their vulnerable population from predation by foreign criminals online?
Yeah, so that's a great question. That's something we talk about as well, exactly what you say. How do they see that vulnerable population actually is a part of national security? And I have to say, only a very few countries at most. So this is a minority situation right now. So it is definitely not being done in the scale that we would like to see to be done in. It's a great point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. I wanted to ask, just given some of the takeaways that you pulled out about, comparing the multilateral aspect of what the focuses are in these different strategies, something that was really interesting that came out last year was this book by Max Smeets called No Shortcuts. It was looking at how different cyber commands are formed in different countries.
Yeah.
And I was just curious if, from an offensive perspective, that is something that you've considered applying a version of your framework to. And then just, if there are, mailing lists for your AI stuff. I'm an AI policymaker in the Office of Management and Budget, and I would love to be added to that if possible. That's the 2 things.
Yeah, that's perfect. You should definitely reach out to us, and we'll keep you in the loop about the AI plans. And for the first question, could you repeat that just one more time? You asked if we apply the framework to offensive.
So the core of the book focuses on cyber command and the way that militaries stand up, like a country or a state military stands up some form of dealing with offensive cyber operations.
Yeah.
So this is not strategy documents. This is more structural and organizational. But the takeaway that you presented about the multilateral sort of comparisons, I was just curious if that framework was something that you thought might apply in a similar way, looking at organizational structure as much as strategy.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And we've been thinking about making another version of this to organizational cybersecurity strategy. We think it translates fairly well. So it's a different context, right? Because to some degree, both of them are driven by the same motivators, state and industry, but to some degree, they're driven by different motivators.
Yeah.
And I will probably do this. I'm discussing collaborations with the Harvard Business School right now. We're going to work on our framework and just translating it to industry cybersecurity strategy. And my hypothesis is that it will translate fairly well. We will have to change some parts, right? But that's generating capacity, kind of stays, but then you have protecting vulnerable people that probably don't stay and so forth. But the general philosophy, I think, is very similar. So that's a great question.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. We're out of time, so I will encourage everyone, please come to the question room. We will walk from there now, and we would really, really like to hear your question there. Thank you so much again.